It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting. Just go to oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. You can contact me there and get a hold of me if you need any kind of PI work. You go to Spreaker.com. You look up John Hankey. The last time we had him on, we were talking about his film called Is Trump for Real? And we got into all the stuff about Cambridge Analytica, great content, but he's also done those classic JFK Jr. assassination films. JFK 3, JFK Part 2, the Bush Connection, and Dark Legacy Part 1 and Part 2. We're talking today about a brand new film. It's called Breakthrough. And he says he's been working on it for 50 years. Excellent film. There's a lot of great new archival video and footage, film footage that I haven't seen before. A lot of information I haven't heard before. You can find this film, Breakthrough, at darkroom.film. As a matter of fact, all these films we just mentioned before, you could find at darkroom.film, but also, too, on the John Hankey YouTube channel. Some of them are up on there, and you can email them directly at xjhankey, Hankey, @gmail.com. Mr. John Hankey, are you there?
Hey, I'm here, and I'm so thoroughly introduced. I really appreciate it.
Okay, man. Thank you so much. We've been talking an hour before the interview even started, so I hope we have something left to say. But remind the audience, who is John Hankey?
Well, I taught for LA Unified in the most financially distraught and what's the word? Retrograde families in Los Angeles, and that's saying a mouthful, for 30 years. And I learned so much from my kids. Intellectually, they were not disadvantaged. In fact, you could argue that life on the street sharpens one's intellect, right? Live smart or die. Anyway, I did that for 30 years, and I was very, very happy doing that. And I used to teach a lesson about this show that Walter Cronkite did, Who Shot President Kennedy? And we would go through it, and I would have them watch it. And I was teaching English and history, a combination, and we would watch it, and then I would have them take a 10-question questionnaire about who they thought did what. And then I would go through and show them all of the lies in the film and the very, very clever ways in which Cronkite would lie. The favorite one is, but you know, there were like 13 major lies that he told. My favorite was that the Congress had a drawing done of a photograph of the back of Kennedy's head, an autopsy photograph. Only the artist eliminated the 5-inch fist-sized hole that every professional in the Dallas emergency room said was there, and replaced it with a, I don't know, half-inch hole. And in the beginning of the video, the Cronkite video, he says what I just told you, that this was a drawing. And he then shows the doctors saying that, no, it was a 5.5-inch hole. And at the climax at the end of the video, he says, the doctors all said this, but what about this photo? Showing this small hole in the back of Kennedy's head. Well, obviously the doctors were confused. They were excited because they had this dead president on the table. They must have made a mistake. Anyway, and I was happy doing that. But then I think it was Plausible Denial came out, and Plausible Denial by Mark Lane. I should explain that. I think that Spotlight magazine and a very reputable New Jersey paper both published an article based on a memo from James Angleton, the head of CIA counterintelligence, right? If there was a guy at the CIA whose job was to know who killed Kennedy, it was Angleton. And Angleton in the memo says that Hunt was involved and that he was in Dallas the day of the assassination. And then Spotlight magazine, which was a little bit more sensationalist, published it, and Hunt and the CIA sued them And Mark Lane, who, if people don't know, is probably the original great JFK anti-Warren researcher. Rush to Judgment was his first book, but then he wrote the subsequent one, which I recommend, Plausible Denial. And he gets to cross-examine Hunt. And he also gets to put on Marita Lorenz, who was a member of Operation Mongoose. And Mongoose says, yeah, Hunt was, we piled into these station wagons full of guns, and we drove into Dallas, and Hunt came walking into the room and started out passing out maps and money. And she says Ruby and Oswald were also there. And, you know,
she also had a romantic relationship with Frank Sturgis and also Fidel Castro, because she was involved in the plot against Castro.
I'm pleased that you know. And she wrote a book about it.
Oh, yeah.
They made a movie about it.
Well, real quick, for the audience, you know, my friend A.J. Weberman, she would have Thanksgiving dinner at A.J. Weberman's house every Thanksgiving. So she's like, sort of a friend of the show. Okay.
No, well, I knew her daughter well.
Oh, really?
Her daughter and I were friendly. And she told me that her daughter told me that her mother loved the movie, the original JFK to the Bush Connection, which is the same as Dark Legacy. Anyway, in that book, Lane relied very heavily on Colonel Fletcher Prouty, who is Mr. X from the movie JFK. He was the highest-ranking guy in the CIA working in the Pentagon. He had a boss, but in the CIA, he was the highest-ranking guy. I guess he had several bosses. Any general who told him what to do, he was going to do it. Anyway, Prouty influenced Hunt to publish the Hoover Memo, which The Nation magazine had previously published, in which 5 days after the assassination, J. Edgar Hoover names Mr. George Bush of the Central Intelligence Agency as having been at FBI headquarters the day after the assassination, called into FBI headquarters and told that, oh, yes, well, the FBI interviewed all of the Operation Mongoose people, and they were all brokenhearted about the Kennedy assassination. Well, if Hoover had written anything else, we would never have heard of this memo. But he managed to obfuscate his intent sufficiently that nobody got down to the last paragraph. Or if they did, they didn't manage to catch the name Bush, who wasn't right. Bush was not a big name until.
Well, not only that, but he wasn't officially admitted. I don't think he's ever officially admitted being CIA during that period.
Oh no, of course not.
Yeah,
it doesn't matter. Everybody in Operation Mongoose practically says that he was in Operation Mongoose. Anyhow, that got me rolling. That Bush, by the time I was reading this, Bush had certainly been vice president. He may have been president by that time. It was around the time. And so I said, I got to put this stuff together and started investigating Bush's connections. Right. In my experience, you get out and you turn over every single rock, because what you're looking for is not going to be under the rock that it's supposed to be under. You'll find it, in this weird admission that Hunt worked for Averell Harriman. It's the only place you will find that particular piece of information. But Harriman was the richest guy in the U.S., and he was a minion of the Rothschilds, and you can't prove a connection between him and Hunt, except that Hunt said it on the stand during this trial. Anyhow, so I got caught up in all of this stuff and began to focus on producing videos. And when I retired from teaching, which was about 8 years ago, that's all I have been doing. And the most difficult nut to crack was figuring out how I guess I'll just say this. Everybody told me Johnson killed Kennedy. And,
right.
I'm okay, fine. It seems obvious.
Roger Stone told us that. Who was friends with all these guys, okay?
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, Nixon told you that. E. Howard Hunt told you that. There's any number of people who you can show were involved in the assassination will tell you that Johnson was involved. But the thing is that in 1968, Johnson was trying to negotiate an end to the Vietnam War. This is the story as it came to me, was that the one that made the headline was that it came out that Nixon had involved himself and had told, so Johnson is trying to negotiate an end to the war in Vietnam in Paris, and Nixon tells the South Vietnamese not to negotiate. And on that basis, the South Vietnamese refused to negotiate. Nixon says, I'll get you a better deal. You get me elected and I'll get you a better deal. And so the South Vietnamese pulled out. Now, there are conversations between Johnson and Everett Dirksen, who was the leader of the House. I believe it was the House, might have been the Senate at the time. And Johnson gets Dirksen to agree that this is treason. And he gets Dirksen to agree to tell Nixon to cut it the hell out. But if Johnson killed Kennedy so that Johnson could wage the Vietnam War, why is he trying to make peace in 68? What happened? And so I wanted to find that's been the real thing that has burned up my brain cells in the last 8 years, is trying to identify the point at which Johnson turned against the Vietnam War. And we can go down that rabbit hole, and I don't mean to. Rabbit hole is not the right word, but it's a lengthy story. And let me tell the short version, and we can come back.
Let me stop you for 1 second, John Hankey.
Sure.
Are you the one who narrates the film Breakthrough?
I'm the one who edits the film. I do all the animations. I do the recording. Anyway,
and you narrate it too. You narrate it too.
Yes.
Well, I got to tell you something. It's very impressive because you use a lot of logic, and you kind of say, "Well, if this and this happened, well, this had to have happened," you know. And it's a lot of common sense in the film, and I really, really encourage people to check this out. You could find it once again at darkroom.film, but also John Hankey on YouTube channel John Hankey.
And you'll put up a link, yeah.
I promise you. I'll put up a link.
Okay, yeah, because, I'm being canceled.
Yeah.
You may not be able to get to it if you don't have the link, but Darkroom, I'm rather certain Darkroom hasn't been canceled yet that I know of, but they may any time. But let me say, just capping on what you said, that's all. Logic and reason is all we have, because every source of information is so completely compromised. You can't believe anybody. And what you have to do then is collect as many of the alleged facts as you can and look at them and see what makes sense and see what doesn't. And when you have something that doesn't make sense, you can throw that out. And, you whittle down the available facts that you have, and you have to start with your whittling. You have to start with stuff that's absolutely uncontested, that people who hate each other agree, and people who hate each other agree that Johnson was in Paris in 68, that he had his people in Paris in 68 trying to negotiate an end to the war. I know somebody who was an eyewitness to it, and they thought that they had settled it. They were celebrating that they had reached an agreement and that the war was going to end. And then Nixon, and I'm telling you, there are phone conversations that you can hear between Nixon and Everett Dirksen in which they discuss how Nixon managed to kill that. Henry Kissinger was also involved, but nobody knows that hardly because nobody had heard of Henry Kissinger at the time. He was a nobody, but that's how he made his bone. And anyway, so I started looking for when did Johnson turn, and one of the things I turned up early is that in 1961, Johnson wrote, Kennedy was surrounded by people saying, bomb them, his first month in office, they told him to send 200,000 troops and to start bombing. And Kennedy resisted the remainder of his life. He sent 16,000 advisors, and I don't mean to let him off the hook. Biden hasn't sent 16,000 advisors to Ukraine, so
that we know about. Okay.
Well, they'd be coming home in body bags anyway.
Well, you watch a lot of those videos, man. They're talking English. Those videos, these mercenaries. They got mercenaries galore over there.
Yeah. I stand corrected. Yeah. That we know about, because certainly there are lots and lots and lots and lots of people in Ukraine at the moment who are U.S. operatives, and they may be parading around as Ukrainians, and they may not be. They may be parading around as Americans. Anyhow, Americans who have converted to Ukrainianism. Anyway, they're now Ukrainian citizens. Anyway, in 1961, Kennedy is surrounded by people saying, from his first month in office, send 200,000 troops, start bombing, and Kennedy sends Johnson in 1961. And Johnson goes and he comes back and he writes an 11-page memo, and in bold letters he says, and it's in the video, the exact language, the page from the document, don't you ever consider sending troops to Vietnam. It would be absolutely, and unless you want to end up like the French chasing your regulars around the rice paddies of Southeast Asia, you better not do it. Support Diem. Diem's a hero. Support Diem to the max, but do not send a troop, a U.S. soldier, to Vietnam. Well, that's interesting. So where do we go from there? And really, this is the most sensational part is naming the shooters. So let's promise that when I finish with this, we'll start naming the shooters. But it's really, I think, an understanding any president of the United States and how the presidents are all manipulated and controlled. This is a very important topic. What you don't know, and I mentioned that all sources of information are so unreliable. I mean, the people that you rely on and who you know to be honest, people are relying on documents that they trust to be real, and they're not. For example, did you know that Kennedy was, before you saw my video, did you know that Kennedy had hardcore plans to exit Vietnam?
No, actually, no. And who was that fellow again? Who it was the fellow who was in the Oliver Stone movie, JFK, right?
Fletcher Prouty.
Fletcher Prouty. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that at all.
Right?
I wasn't aware of that at all.
It's. I'm sorry.
I wasn't aware of that at all. That there was video of Fletcher Prouty saying that.
Which is kind of weird because, right? I mean, he's in. Fletcher Prouty is right there. Well, now this is a rabbit hole, but God damn it, I'm sorry.
It's fine.
God bless us all. God bless us, everyone. It's a hole that's worth taking a minute to go down. Prouty's in the movie JFK. He's Mr. X. And Stone knows him very, very well. And Garrison and Prouty were closest of friends. Jim Garrison, the district attorney of New Orleans, that the movie JFK is about. And I highly recommend that everyone run out and watch the movie JFK while you're at it. Remind yourself it's the 60th anniversary of the assassination in a month.
Is it?
So do that. Anyhow, Prouty describes how JFK came up with the idea that he's going to send Taylor and McNamara to Vietnam. He didn't want to let them go to Vietnam. They insisted. I don't remember who it was. Somebody came back from Vietnam and said, "Oh man, we have that business. The government is completely corrupt. The army is completely corrupt. The people of Vietnam completely support the communists." Mm-hmm. Ho Chi Minh is pop. If there was an election tomorrow, Eisenhower said this. If there was an election tomorrow, Ho Chi Minh would get 90% of the vote. Well, you can't win a war under those circumstances. Everybody worked for the communists. Every plan that the U.S. military came up with was known by the communists before it was known by the people in the army who were responsible for carrying it out. Anyhow, so it was, it was just a disaster. It was a disaster from starting in 1961. It was a huge disaster. And Kennedy gets the idea that rather than take all the heat, he will send Taylor and McNamara to Vietnam, and he's going to write their trip report. And he calls General Krulak into the room and says, write their trip report. And Krulak goes back and calls together a crew, including Fletcher Prouty, and says, okay, the president wants us to write the trip report. And so they write the trip report, and Krulak comes back from Kennedy and says, he wants in there that all U.S. personnel, when they write it up, they say all U.S. military out of Vietnam by the end of calendar 65. They write that up. Krulak takes it to Kennedy. Krulak comes back and says, Kennedy says all personnel. He doesn't want all military. He wants the CIA out as well. So we're going to write all personnel. And this is what Mr. X says in the movie. It's what Prouty says. John Judge did a number of interviews with Fletcher Prouty geez Louise. Prouty.com. He used to sell them. Anyway, any number of interviews where Prouty says this, and the thing is that Prouty holds up the FRUS, Foreign Relations of the United States, which is supposed to be a document that contains every single semi-important document of U.S. foreign policy, and there's 150 volumes. And Prouty holds up the book and says, it's in here. It's all in here. And the thing is that, and he says, right, so that's what they put in it. This guy, Professor James Galbraith at the University of Texas, very prestigious individual. He gets published all the time. And somebody hands him,
John, it sounds like you're rustling some papers or something.
No, that's just my jacket.
Yeah, I could hear it. Yeah,
so sorry.
No, that's okay. It's not that bad.
I'll try to be aware of that.
Yeah. Galbraith.
Somebody hands him a box that says, they declassified 200,000 documents. Here's your box. And he's going through this box, and he finds this little memo from Maxwell Taylor, October 6th, saying the president has decided that we're going to have everybody out by the end of calendar 65, and all your decisions henceforth will be directed at achieving that goal. This language comes from the Tripp report that, right, Kennedy had McNamara and Taylor write that included that language, except when you go to the FRUS and look for it, that language is not in the Tripp report. So that every honest scholar pursuing this stuff has looked at these documents, and they're a forgery.
Really?
So Kennedy issued this order. Well, Johnson was there, and one of Johnson's speechwriters, whose name isn't coming to my mind, but it's in the video. You see the page from the book that he wrote about it. Johnson handed him that document, and Johnson told this guy, they're trying to push me into a war over there, and I need you to help me, avoid them being able to do it. And the guy says, and he hands the speechwriter a document from McNamara saying, yes, we need to bomb the hell out of them and send 200,000 troops. And the guy writes in the book that, that's curious to me because, a few months before this Tripp report said that he was recommending that everybody be out by the end of 65. So that Johnson saw the Tripp report. Johnson handed it to this guy. Well, and now we have all these people who think that they know what's going on, and honest people. I don't really want to name any names and slur anybody, but people who I have trusted and looked up to all my life who said that 3 days, and it's in the Stone film, it's in JFK, 3 days after the assassination, the Sunday after the funeral, Johnson passed out NSAM 273, in which he completely reverses Kennedy's decision. Well, now this is interesting. You can go to the FRUS and you can find NSAM 273 in the FRUS, and it's in the video. You can see it. You don't have to look it up, but you could. By the way, in my video, and I welcome anybody, if you see a document, you want to find it, you take 5 words, consecutive words, put quotes around them, and it should bring that document up out of the U.S. government archives. anyway.
Yeah, and the last 30 minutes of the film was all footnotes. This is the film Breakthrough. You can find it at darkroom.film and also on the John Hankey YouTube channel. And the last 30 minutes is all footnotes where he goes into detail on all this stuff.
Well, and all throughout the film you get to see the document. I never make a reference to a document or to a book without showing you the actual page from the document or from the book.
Well, then let me hit you with this, because there's some stuff in there I haven't seen before, and one is where you say that George Bush was arrested that day.
Okay, so I'm going to wrap this up about Johnson. The day Johnson is dusting the dirt from his hands from Kennedy's funeral, and he walks and he confronts these guys that he knows. I mean, Hoover knew everything. Oswald worked for Hoover. That's not a mystery. The Attorney General of the state of Texas told the Warren Commission that Oswald worked for Hoover. It's so obvious. Anyway, Johnson walks in, confronts these people, all of whom he knows were involved in Kennedy's murder, and he hands them NSAM 273, which says, "We are going to carry out the decisions of October 2nd contained in the trip report." And he says, anybody who doesn't like it should find another job. He's looking at the killers. I mean, this is really, 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 really bold stuff. And for the next 13 months, they're pounding Johnson that he has to send troops. And then after Pleiku, Johnson caves. And Galbraith told me a story that they told Johnson they were going to kill his family. Robert Dallek came walking out of the Johnson Library and walked into Galbraith's office and said, "I just saw the CIA document in which they tell Johnson that Castro is going to kill his family." Well, Johnson knows. They had previously told Johnson that Castro had hired Oswald, and just ridiculous drama. 5 minutes after they tell Johnson that Castro had hired Oswald, Hoover walks calls Johnson up and says, "That's all a lie. I've got the tapes. I've got the pictures. That's not Oswald. That's CIA imposters pretending to be Oswald. But the CIA is lying to you the day after the assassination." And what does that tell you?
Well, and also too, JFK had referred to the guys involved with the Bay of Pigs. He had called them a bunch of gangsters, a bunch of shooters. What was the phrase you used?
I'm not sure what you're referring to.
I'll have to go back.
Oh, what's his name? No. What Hoover calls the misguided anti-Castro Cubans.
Yeah, well, he called them a bunch of shooters, a bunch of hitmen.
Oh, you know what?
Well, I don't know what the exact phrase was, but it was something along those lines. Hey, these guys are a bunch of... Yeah.
See, oh, my goodness. Well, you have to watch the video, ladies and gentlemen. It took me 50 years, and there's a lot of stuff in it, and I made it as fast as I could. And I saw all of this stuff with these quotes that you're mentioning. There was this huge confrontation, right? These are the guys who killed Kennedy.
Yeah.
But before the missile crisis, you remember the missile crisis, the entire world was on the brink of a nuclear holocaust, and it was these guys who shot Kennedy who were carrying on terrorism against Cuba that got Castro, to go to Khrushchev and say, "Why don't you give us missiles?" And Khrushchev looked at the evidence that the CIA was preparing another invasion of Cuba and said, "All right." And because they had the evidence that they were preparing another invasion of Cuba, and Kennedy has a meeting after the missile crisis, and they were still doing it. And he goes around the room and says, "These guys are still doing it. They're trying to provoke World War III. It looks like. What should we do?" And everybody in the room, Robert Kennedy, who is supervising these guys, and you get to see the documents establishing that Robert Kennedy was in charge of Operation Mongoose, the guys who killed his brother. He was absolutely in charge of them. You can argue that he wasn't in charge of them that afternoon, and it might be true and it might not be true, and it doesn't. We're not talking about that today anyhow, but Kennedy is saying, these Operation Mongoose guys are trying to start another World War III. What should we do? And they go around the room, and Robert says, "I don't know. I don't know how to get a hold of them." And Johnson says, "We should get the military to kill them." Johnson says, these guys are trying to start World War III. The military should exterminate them. This is Johnson. And these are the guys who killed Kennedy 30 days later. Anyway, maybe
fascinating because I interviewed Mr. Hunt, who was Frank Sturgis's nephew, who was his alibi for that day, and he talks about Frank Sturgis having his own B-25 bomber. They were making the napalm in their garage. He was collecting money for gangsters and mafia people. They had nothing. They could pick these guys. They were all dealing coke, right? They were all smuggling coke at that point by then, right? They had nothing to pick these guys up on.
Who's they?
You're right, DEA. I guess. Yeah, right. Who would do it? Yeah.
No. Well, the thing is that. Well, and so let's get down to this. Good. They decide. Kennedy writes this October 6th. Kennedy makes this decision. McNamara says the decision is October 2nd. The Taylor memo is dated October 6th, if I'm not mistaken. Oswald gets hired at the book depository a week later. So clearly, the military-industrial complex, whoever they are, the London bankers, in case I haven't said that, the United States is run by the London bankers and has been since 1776, but let's just move right along. They decide they got to kill Kennedy, and they send Oswald to work in the book depository because they know that he is an FBI agent, and that'll really work well for them, that they're going to set up an FBI agent to take the blame for the assassination that they're going to carry out. And then they go out looking for shooters. And every shooter in the world who's not if he's a professional, he knows that you can't kill the president of the United States and see the sun come up. They can't let you live if you agree to do it and do it. And so nobody will take the job. And which is why we find just this mountain of evidence that E. Howard Hunt was the Knowles shooter. And in JFK to the Bush Connection, in Dark Legacy 1, which is the same movie, I established the case. And, Jesus Angleton, I'm telling you, Oswald certainly worked for Jesus Angleton as well, which is why they won't release Oswald's W-2s, because it would show that he was a spy. He was spying on rogue elements for Angleton, and he was spying on rogue elements for the FBI. Anyway, they decide that they're going to kill Kennedy and they are going to set up Oswald, but they can't find a shooter, which is why Hunt, who says he was the head of the CIA's Western Division at one time, he certainly under Lansdale was in charge of Operation Mongoose. Ed Lansdale, is the guy who ordered Fletcher Prouty to go to the South Pole during the assassination. He isn't named by Prouty in the movie JFK, but anyway, he's the major figure, and he answers directly to Robert Kennedy and no one else. So it's a short chain of command, and Hunt is third in that chain of command, as is Bush. So in JFK to the Bush Connection, I show all of these connections between Bush and Hunt in order to try to incriminate Bush based on his connection to Hunt, there's such overwhelming evidence that he was the Knowles shooter. Hunt's son describes being in a phone booth and looking up at a poster in San Francisco. Dick Gregory was going around speaking, and he had a picture of the Tramps, and Hunt's son looked up at the poster and said, "Oh my God, that's my dad." Yeah,
St. John Hunt was on my show, and he said, "It sounds." Did you get that from my show? Because he tells that story word for word, as I heard it on your film. Where'd you get that from?
I don't know.
That could have been my show. You would have heard me next making a joke. Yeah, I was making a joke right after that. You should have heard me. But did you know that St. John Hunt recently, in the past few years, went to work for Roger Stone?
I'm not the least bit surprised. He's a human being. He's got to pay his bills. Yeah,
and so there he was, pointed out to Hunt, but then later on, he's working for Roger Stone as his ghostwriter. He might still be.
I don't want to say a word against.
No, I like him. Yeah, I like all these guys. Yeah.
Oh well, I don't know that Yeah, never mind.
I know. I get along with them.
Well, you have to. It's your job. Yeah. You have to get along with me, as obnoxious as I am.
You're great.
Anyway, so. Let's get to George Bush.
Yeah.
We mentioned that George Bush was named by Hoover as having been called into FBI headquarters the day after the assassination. Now, what transpired, I don't have a clue, but there was a Hoover also wrote a memo to every FBI headquarters, and this is in the movie JFK, saying there's going to be an assassination attempt upon the president in Dallas on November 22nd. Well, so they knew about it in advance. There's every reason to think that, I mean, if Oswald was their operative and Oswald was at the meeting at the Dallas motel, they must have known. They likely had Hunt's phone tapped. So God knows what they knew, but why they didn't cancel the motorcade is anybody's guess. But what are we focusing on? We're focusing on Bush. And so Bush is named as having been a supervisor of these guys who Hoover knew had plotted the assassination. So you have to have that understanding that Hoover knew that when he wrote this memo and said that Bush was the CIA individual to whom this information was related. Okay, that's one. On Bush. Two is that there's a guy named Joseph McBride, a really great guy, who he writes about movies. And I spoke to him, and he told me that he was in the Hollywood Library doing research for a movie, and he got sick of it. He couldn't stand it anymore, so he got up and walked over and said, "What do you got?" And they said, "Well, we have these documents that were released by the Assassination Review Board." And he says, "Well, that's different." And he takes them, and he's looking through them, and he finds this memo, the one that I have just been speaking of, that was written by Hoover. And he writes about it in the Nation magazine, and Bush responds to it and says, "Oh, it's not me." And so McBride contacts Bush's campaign because he's running for president, and he isn't allowed to speak with Bush, but he is allowed to speak with somebody who supposedly goes back and forth and brings back answers. And McBride says, "Where was Bush the day of the assassination?" And the guy comes back and says, "Well, he was an independent oil man from Houston, and so he was probably in Houston. He was somewhere in Texas. He definitely was not the George Bush of the memo. And he definitely wasn't in Dallas." Well,
let me interrupt you for a second there, John Hankey, because where's the other George Bush? The other George Bush has gone down in history as being mistaken for this George Bush. Don't you think he'd come forward and say, "Oh, no, that was me"?
McBride found another George Bush at the CIA who said, "Hell no, that's not me. I analyze photographs. I don't get called into FBI headquarters for anything."
So they couldn't even get that guy to play the part. Okay.
They didn't. Well, no, this is an interesting point, and it's really the golden ticket, which is they are so confident in their control and power, and so confident in our stupidity that they're not very careful. They're not as careful as I think you or I would be if we were in their position.
Yeah, that is so true.
They're accustomed to running roughshod. They know that the New York Times, they don't care what the New York Times publishes one day because they're going to make sure that they retract it and publish the opposite story every day for the next 60 years. So if you get the New York Times from the day of the assassination, the extra edition that they put out, Tom Weicker, the reporter, the famous reporter, was there and Kennedy's press secretary told it at a press conference, and you see video of it in the video. He told the New York Times reporter that Kennedy was shot in the temple and through the head. He points to his temple and says that Kennedy was killed by a bullet right through the head. And that was in the New York Times the day of the assassination, and never again. And, as I say, the opposite lie was recorded. So anyway, Bush, those people have learned to not be very careful. The point is, Bush says he wasn't he was somewhere in Texas, and he was not in Dallas. And it turns out, it wasn't me, somebody found the FBI memo Bush called the FBI an hour and 15 minutes after Kennedy was declared dead, if I'm not mistaken. 1:45. Kennedy was shot at 12:30. I don't think he was declared dead until 1. So 45 minutes after he was declared dead, Kennedy called the FBI and talked to an agent named Kitchell, who thought that the conversation was so suspicious and ridiculous that he made a very, very careful record of it, including where Bush was staying, which was at the Dallas Sheraton. The day of the assassination, he was staying at the Dallas Sheraton. Somebody else who I'm glad to say I don't even remember their name, but they're a JFK researcher, they claim, and they claim, they think a lot of themselves, and I don't have any respect for them whatsoever, except that they found a Dallas Morning News advertisement that shows that George Bush was speaking to an organization of independent oil operators. Wow. In the Dallas Sheraton the night before the assassination. So we know that he was there the night before, and we know that he was there the day after. So he's lying about that. Well, that's not a small deal, is it? No, and
just think, too, if this was an hour after the shooting, he probably just rushed into that room, in that hotel room, sweating and huffing and puffing. Where's the phone number? Let me get on the phone. I don't think he could have been too convincing, an hour after a big event like that. I don't care how.
What's he going to tell them?
Yeah.
So he makes up this story that some junior member, because he's running for Senate at the time, right. He makes up the story. The story he tells Kitchell is that some junior member of his campaign was talking about killing the president, but he doesn't know when and he doesn't know where. And if I'm the FBI agent, these guys, it's one of the things, whatever anyone thinks about law enforcement, they do it for a living, and you get to be good at it. It was my favorite part. There's a movie about O.J.
Yeah.
And the L.A. cops call O.J. He's in Chicago, and they say, your wife's been murdered. We want you to come to L.A. and talk to us, and blah, blah, blah. And they hang up, and the guy looks at the rest of the cops in the room and says, he didn't ask how his wife was murdered. And they all look at each other and say, oh, Jesus Christ, that guy killed his wife. Well, if someone told you that they were planning to kill the president of the United States and you don't remember where or when, you are lying.
What about the fellow who took Bush into custody shortly for that short period of time? Yeah, was he ever interviewed and say, hey, do you recognize Bush? You couldn't track him down?
So
it's only been 50 years.
So, thank you.
Yeah.
So we're done with that element. Next point on Bush, the incredible part. Let me introduce and say that Garrison, the New Orleans district attorney who's trying to bring a case against Clay Shaw for the murder of the president, calls up the. It occurs to him to find out who was arrested that day, and he calls up, I think, Police Chief Curry, and says, I'd like records of all the people who were arrested that day. And Curry tells him, you can't have them, and we didn't arrest anybody. And again, Garrison is a professional. He's used to calling up police chiefs and asking for arrest records. He is not used to getting that answer. And he goes to bed furious, and he wakes up and says, wait a minute, because Garrison had made friends with all sorts of Dallas police, including Roger Craig. And Roger Craig was Deputy of the Year in 1962. He's not a slouch. And his uncle was a detective. Well, the way you get made a detective is by being an excellent patrolman, right? If you excel, if you write really good, detailed reports that include the important information and ask the right questions and get the right answers, that's how you become a detective. Vaughn was Craig's uncle. As I found one source that said that Vaughn was Craig's uncle, and it doesn't much matter, but Craig writes, he wrote an article about it. It's at ratville.org. And he says that Garrison called him up and said, look, You guys aren't idiots. You were there. I would like to know about every arrest that was made in Dealey Plaza that day. And so Vaughn goes around and he asks all the cops, who all respect him, why wouldn't they? And they all talk to him. And his uncle, of course, speaks to him. And his uncle tells him about how, after the assassination, he was walking in front of the Dow Tex building, which is catty corner from the book depository, and the crowd is all up in arms and vehement, and hands him this guy who they say had come walking out of the building, from which they had all heard shots fired, and the guy apparently attracted the crowd's attention because he looked so guilty, and they grabbed him and they hand him over to Vaughn. And so Vaughn is escorting him to the police station under arrest for suspicion of being one of the shooters. And the guy tells Vaughn, so what are you doing in Dallas? Oh, I'm an independent oil operator from Houston. Well, if the guy is a shooter, and there were shots fired from the Daltex building, somebody in that building was a shooter and came walking out the front door, and the crowd thought that it was Bush. Whoever that individual was, they hadn't been told to use the cover that was clearly Bush's official cover that day. He told that cover story to Kitchell, the FBI agent. He told that cover story to Joseph McBride, the reporter who asked him about it. He was working for Mongoose. There's all this evidence to show that what he was doing, and his company was Zapata Offshore Oil, and what Zapata Offshore Oil was doing was covering for CIA operations, terrorist operations against Cuba, Mongoose terrorist operations against Cuba. Anyhow, this is a story that's really, 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 really hard to believe, don't you think? And so, but I've had 10 years or so to stew on it. And one of the things I ran into was a quote from George Sr.'s father, Prescott, who was a very, very, very dark character. Prescott was Harriman's right-hand man. Harriman is a very, very, very dark character. Oh, my goodness. Anyway, so Prescott was having a friendly conversation with some other monster, I'm sure, who bothered to record the fact that Prescott said that he felt that George felt that everything had to be handed to him on a silver platter, and he needed to earn he had to get his hands dirty. And it's one of the things of Skull and Bones. And I used to be interested in Skull and Bones. I'm much less interested than I was. But Harriman was in Skull and Bones, and Prescott was in Skull and Bones, and George H.W. was in Skull and Bones. And so was the F. Truby Davison, the guy who became head of hiring for the CIA at the time that Bush was hired by the CIA to go work at. And there's a letter in the video that establishes all of that Dulles and Prescott and Bush's first employer were all working together to aid CIA operations in the Caribbean. Anyhow,
they were using a Bush oil rigger as their base of operations out there. And one of the, like you mentioned in the film, one of the ships, too, was named after Bush's wife, Barbara.
We can talk about that, and we should, because...
Well, we only got we got 3 minutes left. Okay, got 3 minutes left.
We got 3 minutes left. Well, if we got 3 minutes left, let me say a couple of things as quickly as I can. The military-industrial complex is multi-generational. It goes back to the 1800s at least. It goes back to the 1700s. You can document it in a bold, solid, straight line from the 1700s to the people who are pushing the war in Ukraine. Let's observe that Kennedy's assassination was really, really, really bad for the United States reputation. Biden's continuing cover-up of of refusing to release the documents is really bad for the U.S. reputation, which is startling until you realize that the guys who killed Kennedy and who are in control are not Americans. They don't care about right. They don't care about America's reputations because they're not Americans. And the people pushing the war in Ukraine is a disaster for the Ukrainians. It's a disaster for all of the European countries that are sending all of this money that they don't have to Ukraine. What are they getting out of it? What is anybody getting out of the war in Ukraine? It's terrible for the U.S. reputation because the globe is watching this happen, and they see who started this stuff and who provoked it and who is refusing to negotiate a peaceful solution to it, and they all blame the U.S., and it's bad for the U.S. The one element that it's really, really, really good for is the military-industrial complex, and those are the guys who killed Kennedy. They're the guys who are doing Ukraine. Obviously, they control Biden, and how did they control Johnson? They threatened to kill his family. How are they controlling Biden? I don't know. Maybe they're threatening to kill him.
There's $250 billion floating around. I think I know how to control them. Okay? You couldn't stand on that kind of money. John Hankey, we couldn't climb to a pile of the top of that kind of money. All right?
True that.
You know what I'm saying? The film we've been talking about today is called Breakthrough. Breakthrough. Darkroom.film, you could find it there. But John Hankey has his own YouTube channel with his films. You can find Breakthrough there. You can contact him directly at xjhankey, HANKEY @gmail.com. John, let's confirm it up right now. Can you do next Sunday, same time, same channel?
Absolutely.
Okay, we'll come back and we'll cover up because I wanted John to focus on the damn shooters today. Okay, but I couldn't quite reel him in. But next week, I promise you, we're going to get into the shooters. There's so much stuff here. Ted Shackley, he was arrested too that day, he tells us. There's just so much here. There were doubles there in the crowd of Bush and Shackley, all kinds of stuff in this film. FDR was killed, he believes. Adlai Stevenson's not in the film, but he believes was killed. That's not even in the film. Ton of material here. Plus, we're going to go over Mr. John Hankey's previous films, which I never did. Is Trump for Real? We had him on for that. Look that up. Opperman, Spreaker, Is Trump for Real? Use Dogpile or a search engine like that. Dark Legacy 2, and JFK 2, The Bush Connection. All great films. I first spotted these films of John Hankey years and years and years ago, just on some obscure internet channel, but just more and more impressed. I love this film, Dark. It's called Breakthrough. But you can find it at darkroom.film. Man, come on, I'm losing my mind here. It's John Hankey, man. Thank you so much. I'll see you next week, okay?
You bet.
Thank you, sir. Good night.